The last 10 years have witnessed a dramatic escalation in trade tensions between the United States and its major trading partners. Disagreements over trade balances, intellectual property rights, and national security concerns have led to a tit-for-tat exchange of tariffs. These tariffs, taxes imposed on imported goods, have disrupted global supply chains and increased prices for consumers and businesses. The U.S., under the Trump administration, adopted a particularly aggressive approach to trade policy. This approach was characterized by a focus on reducing trade deficits and protecting American jobs, even if it meant imposing tariffs unilaterally. The result was a series of trade disputes that have reshaped the global trade landscape. This essay will examine the key trade conflicts between the U.S. and countries like China, the European Union, Canada, Mexico, and India. It will analyze the evolution of U.S. tariff policies, culminating in the controversial 2025 shift to reciprocal tariffs. Finally, it will assess the impact of these policies on global trade and the U.S. economy. The trade disputes of the past decade represent a significant shift away from the free trade principles that have governed the global economy for decades. Understanding the causes and consequences of these disputes is essential for navigating the increasingly complex world of international trade. The trade relationship between the U.S. and China, the world's two largest economies, has been particularly fraught. In 2018, the Trump administration imposed tariffs on billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods, citing concerns over unfair trade practices and intellectual property theft. China retaliated with tariffs of its own on U.S. products like soybeans, automobiles, and aircraft. This initial exchange of tariffs marked the beginning of what has become known as the trade war between the two countries. Over the next few years, the U.S. and China continued to escalate tariffs, targeting an increasingly wide range of goods. By 2025, tariffs on some Chinese goods imported into the U.S. had reached as high as 54%. China, in turn, imposed tariffs on almost all U.S. imports. The U.S. approach to tariffs on China was characterized by a focus on reducing the bilateral trade deficit and pressuring China to change its economic policies. The Trump administration argued that China's state-led economic model gave its companies unfair advantages, and that its policies forced American companies to transfer technology to Chinese competitors. China, for its part, argued that the U.S. tariffs were protectionist and violated international trade rules. It accused the U.S. of trying to contain its economic rise and undermine its development. The trade war between the U.S. and China had significant global implications, disrupting supply chains, raising prices for consumers, and creating uncertainty in financial markets. The U.S. also engaged in significant trade disputes with the European Union, a long-standing ally and trading partner. In 2018, the Trump administration imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum imports from the EU, citing national security concerns. The EU retaliated with tariffs on U.S. products such as motorcycles, bourbon, and jeans. The U.S. and EU also clashed over subsidies to the aircraft industry. The World Trade Organization, WTO, ruled that both the U.S. and EU had provided illegal subsidies to their respective aircraft manufacturers, Boeing and Airbus. This ruling led to further rounds of tariffs between the two sides. In 2019, the U.S. imposed tariffs on $7.5 billion worth of EU goods, including wine, cheese, and olives, after a WTO ruling related to Airbus subsidies. The EU threatened further retaliation if the U.S. did not remove its tariffs. The trade disputes between the U.S. and the EU highlighted the growing tensions over trade imbalances, industrial subsidies, and the role of the WTO in resolving disputes. The Trump administration's willingness to impose tariffs unilaterally and its skepticism of multilateral institutions like the WTO strained relations with the EU. Trade relations between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, once governed by the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, also experienced significant turbulence. In 2018, the Trump administration imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum imports from both Canada and Mexico, again citing national security concerns. Canada and Mexico responded with retaliatory tariffs on a range of U.S. products including agricultural goods, steel, and consumer products. The tariffs disrupted supply chains and increased costs for businesses and consumers in all three countries. The U.S., Canada, and Mexico eventually renegotiated NAFTA, replacing it with the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA. While the USMCA addressed some of the Trump administration's concerns about trade deficits and rules of origin, it did not fully resolve the underlying trade tensions. Section 5. India, a unique case of tariff retaliation. The United States also engaged in trade disputes with India, a country with which it has sought to strengthen economic and strategic ties. In 2019, the Trump administration revoked India's preferential trade status under the Generalized System of Preferences, or GSP. The GSP program provides duty-free access to the U.S. market for certain goods from developing countries. The U.S. decision to revoke India's GSP status was part of a broader effort to pressure India to open its market to more U.S. goods and address concerns about its trade practices. India responded by imposing tariffs on 28 U.S. products, including almonds, apples, and walnuts. The trade dispute between the U.S. and India underscored the challenges of balancing economic and strategic interests in a complex geopolitical environment. While the two countries share common concerns about China's growing influence, their trade differences have at times strained relations. Section 6. The 2025 Shift, Trump's Reciprocal Tariff Policy. In 2025, the Trump administration introduced a significant shift in U.S. tariff policy. Dubbed reciprocal tariffs, this new approach aimed to impose tariffs on imports from countries that maintain high tariffs on U.S. goods. The goal, according to the administration, was to level the playing field and reduce trade deficits. Under the reciprocal tariff policy, the U.S. imposed tariffs on a wide range of goods from countries like China, the EU, Japan, South Korea, and India. The tariffs varied depending on the specific goods and the trading partner, but they generally ranged from 10% to 54%. The reciprocal tariff policy was met with strong criticism from U.S. businesses and trading partners. Critics argued that the tariffs would harm the U.S. economy, increase prices for consumers, and disrupt global supply chains. They also argued that the tariffs would do little to address the underlying causes of trade imbalances. Section 7. Global Impacts, a world grappling with trade wars. The trade disputes initiated by the United States had far-reaching global implications. The tariffs disrupted global supply chains, forcing businesses to find new suppliers and adjust their production processes. The tariffs also increased costs for businesses, which were often passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices. The trade wars contributed to a slowdown in global economic growth. The International Monetary Fund, or IMF, estimated that the trade wars shaved 0.8% off global GDP growth in 2019. The tariffs also created uncertainty in financial markets, leading to volatility in stock prices and exchange rates. The trade disputes also strained relations between the United States and its trading partners. Countries like China, the EU, and Canada retaliated against U.S. tariffs with tariffs of their own. The trade wars damaged the credibility of the rules-based trading system, as countries increasingly resorted to unilateral action rather than multilateral negotiations to resolve their differences. Section 8. The U.S. economy winners and losers in the tariff debate. The impact of the trade wars on the U.S. economy was complex and multifaceted. Some industries, such as steel and aluminum, benefited from the tariffs as they faced less competition from foreign imports. However, many other industries were negatively impacted, as the tariffs increased the cost of imported inputs and reduced demand for U.S. exports. Consumers were also hurt by the tariffs, as they faced higher prices for a wide range of goods, from washing machines to cars. The tariffs also led to job losses in some sectors, as businesses were forced to lay off workers in response to higher costs or reduced demand. The Trump administration argued that the tariffs were necessary to protect American jobs and reduce the trade deficit. However, many economists argued that the tariffs were counterproductive, as they would ultimately harm the U.S. economy more than they would help it. Section 9. Conclusion. Have reciprocal tariffs achieved their goals? The Trump administration's use of tariffs as a tool of economic policy has been one of the most defining features of its approach to international trade. The administration argued that its tariffs were necessary to protect American jobs, reduce the trade deficit, and force trading partners to change their unfair trade practices. However, the evidence suggests that the tariffs have had a mixed impact at best. While they may have provided some short-term benefits to certain industries, they have also imposed significant costs on the U.S. economy as a whole. The tariffs have increased prices for consumers, disrupted supply chains, and reduced business investment. Moreover, there is little evidence that the tariffs have achieved their stated goal of reducing the trade deficit or forcing trading partners to change their behavior. In fact, the trade deficit has actually increased since the tariffs were imposed. And while some countries have made concessions to the US under the threat of tariffs, others have retaliated with tariffs of their own, leading to a trade war that has harmed all sides. The Trump administration's legacy on trade is likely to be debated for years to come. However, it is clear that the tariffs have had a profound impact on the global trading system and the US economy. Whether the long-term costs of the tariffs will outweigh any short-term benefits remains to be seen.